In the grey morning light of wartime Birmingham, the doors of Hudson Co, makers of ACME whistles, stood closed to the public. Soldiers guarded the entrance. Inside, beneath blackout curtains and the clatter of stamping presses, dozens of women worked in secret. Their task seemed almost laughably small, shaping thin brass into little rectangles no bigger than a matchbox. Each press of the die made a metallic click-clack, a noise that, within 24 hours, would echo across the dark fields of Normandy. The order had arrived months earlier, stamped top secret and signed through the War Office. 7,000 clickers were required immediately for a special American request. The paperwork called them ACME 470 signal devices. No one in Birmingham knew precisely what purpose these toys would serve. They only knew the schedule was relentless. When an incendiary bomb fell through the roof during a German air raid, igniting part of the building, the presses were moved to an undamaged wing and running again in 3 days. Each finished piece shiny brass, spring-loaded tongue inside was tested once, boxed in plain brown paper, and marked for shipment under military guard. Across the Channel, the Allied invasion waited on weather reports and tides. Every hour of delay meant more risk of discovery, yet inside that small factory the women built a device meant for confusion, a sound to cut through chaos. The crickets would travel by truck to the ports, by ship to Plymouth, and from there to the airfields of southern England Upottery, Greenham Common, Exeter, where paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division prepared for their first combat jump. On the evening of June 5th, Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor stood in a drafty briefing tent at Upottery Airfield. Outside, C-47 transports idled, their propellers beating the dusk into oily wind. Taylor's paratroopers of the 101st 13,000 men divided among the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments were about to begin Mission Albany, the airborne spearhead of the D-Day invasion. They expected the night to be a storm of flak, searchlights, and scattered landings. Radios would fail, units would splinter, identification in the dark would be a matter of life and death. Taylor's operations officer laid a small brass rectangle on the table. 1 click, you challenge. 2 clicks, you answer. The generals in the tent exchanged puzzled looks, then faint smiles. The sound, a quick metallic tock-tock, seemed almost comical, like a child's toy. But the logic behind it was elegant. Words could betray accents. Flashlights or flares invited bullets. The clicker was silent at distance, yet unmistakable up close, a signal that cut cleanly through rain, wind, and fear. Each paratrooper would carry one in his pocket, to be used only during the first night and dawn of the invasion. After that, the password "Flash Thunder" would replace it before the Germans could imitate the sound. As the sun sank over the hedgerows of Devon, sergeants moved down the rows of aircraft handing out the tiny brass tools. In one stick, a corporal from Iowa clicked his once and laughed. This is how we're going to beat the Krauts? His jumpmaster snapped back. You'll thank that thing when you're knee-deep in a cow pasture and can't tell if the guy in the hedgerow's American or German. At 19:30 hours, the last equipment checks began. Men slung parachutes, weapons, and bundles heavy enough to crush a leg if misdropped. Each carried an Monet rifle, a trench knife, and now the strange new instrument that fit neatly into a breast pocket. Private Arthur Montgomery of the 506th remembered years later that he kept fingering the clicker on the flight line, pressing it until the sergeant ordered him to stop. It made me feel like a kid, again, he said, until I looked down the runway and realized half the fellas were doing the same thing. Upottery's field lights flickered on briefly, 3 long blinks, the signal to board. The roar of engines swelled until conversation was useless. Inside the transports, paratroopers sat on narrow benches along the fuselage walls, helmets tilted, faces smeared with charcoal. The air reeked of fuel and sweat. Each man had been briefed on the terrain of the Cotentin Peninsula, flooded fields, stone farmhouses, miles of hedgerow country, and German positions guarding the approaches to Utah Beach. The plan was simple on paper: land east and south of Sainte-Mère-Église, seize causeways, cut off reinforcements, but every veteran of airborne training knew how easily plans dissolved once the green light flashed. The clickers were supposed to restore some order to that inevitable confusion. A single click in the dark meant, "American here, identify yourself." 2 clicks in, an answer meant, "Friendly." If nothing came back, you fired first. In the rehearsals back in England, the system had seemed foolproof. Now, in the dim red light of the cargo bay, the men wondered whether the tiny brass noise would even carry over gunfire and wind. At 22:30, the first C-47s began rolling down the wet runway. Each carried a dozen paratroopers and a crew of 5. The aircraft lumbered into the mist, climbing slowly toward the channel. Below, the rows of parked transports shrank to silver beads under the moon. Above, the sky filled with hundreds of green tracer-lined exhausts, all pointing toward France. Inside one of the planes, Sergeant Joe Bell of Michigan, later famous as the only American to serve in both the U.S. and Soviet armies, pressed the clicker against his palm and listened to the faint snap. "Sounds like a cricket," he shouted to the man beside him. The other nodded. "Then let's hope it sings loud enough." Far below them, the invasion fleet already covered the channel. Over 5,000 vessels, the largest armada in history. But for the airborne troops, victory would depend not on ships or tanks, but on moments of recognition, tiny flashes of order amid chaos. By midnight, the first formation crossed the French coast. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed red and white in the darkness. Pilots jinked violently, scattering sticks across miles of countryside. Paratroopers jumped through tracer arcs and burning clouds, plunging into an unknown world of flooded fields and enemy searchlights. The sound that guided them was not the rumble of engines or the shouting of officers, but the delicate metallic tock of a child's toy repurposed for war. In Birmingham, the factory that had made those toys was silent now. The night shift had gone home hours earlier, unaware that their day's work was already crossing the channel. One supervisor lingered, walking the empty floor. A single unfinished clicker lay on the bench, its spring half inserted. She pressed it once. The faint click echoed through the workshop, mingling with the distant hum of bombers heading east. Somewhere over Normandy, that same sound, small, bright, unmistakable, was already answering itself in the dark. The roar of the C-47's engines was a living thing, steady, shaking, relentless. Inside, the men of the 101st Airborne sat shoulder to shoulder, faces striped with black grease paint, fingers clamped around rifle stocks and parachute straps. The red light glowed faintly above the jump door, casting everyone in a devil's hue. It was just past midnight. Below them, the coast of Normandy waited in darkness. Private First Class James O'Keefe could not hear anything but engines and his own heartbeat. He pressed the small brass cricket in his pocket, feeling the cool metal edges, the springy resistance of its tongue. 1 click would mean friend, 2 clicks answer. That was the rule. The sound was supposed to cut through chaos. He wondered whether it could cut through fear. When the green light flashed, the jumpmaster shouted and slapped his shoulder. The door opened, and night rushed in like a wall of ice and noise. O'Keefe stepped into nothingness. For an instant there was no sound but wind. Then parachutes cracked open above him like whips, and the sky filled with white canopies, an airborne constellation drifting toward France. But the plan unraveled the moment it began. Clouds and flak scattered the formation across miles. Pilots flying too low and too fast dropped sticks far from their intended zones. Some men landed near Sainte-Mère-Église, others splashed into flooded fields miles from any landmark. The Cotentin Peninsula was a patchwork of meadows, canals, and hedgerows, a natural maze even in daylight. In the darkness, it became a trap. O'Keefe hit the ground hard in knee-deep water. His parachute dragged until it snagged on a hedgerow. He cut himself free, gasping, and crouched in the muck. The night smelled of wet earth, cordite, and distant fire. Somewhere nearby, automatic weapons chattered, then fell silent. He could hear shouting German or English, he couldn't tell. The sound carried strangely through the mist. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cricket, and pressed it once. Click! The noise was small, sharp, metallic. Nothing answered. He tried again, 2 short clicks this time, and waited. From somewhere to his left came a faint answering click, click. His breath caught in relief. A shadow moved through the hedgerow. Flash, O'Keefe whispered. Thunder, came the reply, low and fast. 2 silhouettes emerged, paratroopers from another company, faces smeared, one missing his helmet. They exchanged grins, the kind of brief, stunned smiles that meant they were still alive. Across Normandy that night, thousands of similar encounters unfolded. The crickets snapped in orchards, along ditches, inside barns. For some men, the little toy meant reunion. For others, it was the last sound they ever heard. Near Foucaultville, one patrol clicked once and got silence in return, then a burst of MP40 fire that tore through the hedgerow. The Germans were alert now. A few captured crickets clicked from the wrong direction, sending confusion rippling through scattered squads. By dawn, the order would go out, use the clickers only until sunrise, then switch to the password Flash Thunder. Lieutenant William Dye of the 502nd remembered later that the first hours were a nightmare of noises. Every hedge seemed alive, boots squelching in mud, cows moving in the dark, water lapping against irrigation ditches. The only sure thing was the sound of that tiny brass signal. You'd click once, wait, and if you didn't get 2 back, you froze, he wrote in his diary after the war. It was like fishing in hell. By 2 o'clock, O'Keefe's small group had grown to 10 men. They moved, cautiously through the fields, guided by the dim light of a luminous compass. Every few minutes someone clicked, and somewhere ahead, another answered. The rhythm tock-tock, tock-tock became their heartbeat. It wasn't loud enough to travel far, just far enough. They reached a sunken lane bordered by high hedges. Beyond it lay a farmhouse silhouetted against the sky. From its upper window, a machine gun traced orange lines across the field. The paratroopers dropped flat. Sergeant Mills gestured toward the building, made the signal for silence, and whispered, "Cricket on my mark, then flank left." He pressed the device once. No answer. Again click. Then, faintly, 2 clicks answered from the left. Mills smiled grimly. "Friendly on the flank," he whispered. "Move!" The Americans crawled through the hedgerow, found the farmhouse's rear door unguarded, and burst inside. The Germans upstairs never knew what hit them. When it was over, Mills tossed the cricket on the table beside a dead radio operator. "Hell of a toy," he muttered. All across the Cotentin Peninsula, the crickets performed their strange arithmetic of survival. Men found one another in flooded marshes, on the causeways behind Utah Beach, in the orchards near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. They clicked and listened, building small islands of order in a sea of confusion. By dawn, the eastern horizon glowed dull red. The sound of artillery drifted inland from the beaches. The airborne mission, though scattered, had succeeded in the only way that mattered. The causeways were held, the exits secured, and the German reserves confused about where the main attack would fall. O'Keefe and his little band crouched in a hedgerow, watching columns of smoke rise from the beaches. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cricket once more, and clicked it softly. "Won't need this anymore," he said. Mills grinned. "Keep it. Might bring you luck." Hours later, when they linked up with another company near Sainte-Mère-Église, the officers were already passing word that the devices were to be retired. German troops had begun to mimic the sound, though clumsily. One captured prisoner claimed they thought it was some kind of bird unique to England. Another said it terrified them. The sound meant Americans were nearby, invisible, closing in. That night, exhausted paratroopers dug in along the edge of a Norman orchard. The clickers lay silent now, replaced by whispered passwords and the steady thud of artillery from the coast. But every man who had used one would remember that sound, the quick metallic chirp that meant you weren't alone in the dark. For the rest of his life, O'Keefe kept his cricket in a small box with his jump wings. It was tarnished and bent, the brass dulled by sweat and rain, but when pressed it still made that unmistakable noise, tock tock, the sound of D-Day, tiny, absurd, and unforgettable. When the grey light of dawn crept across the dawn, hedgerows, the battlefield revealed itself chaotic, steaming, alive with movement. The fields that had swallowed the night's parachutes now glittered with dew and smoke. Scattered bundles hung from apple trees, parachute silk draped over fences like ghostly flags. The invasion had begun in earnest, but for hundreds of paratroopers, the fight started hours earlier with confusion, fear, and the faint metallic chirp of a toy. Sergeant Harold Red Kessler of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment had landed in a cow pasture north of Sainte-Mère-Église, 20 miles from his intended drop zone. His harness was tangled in his gear, and the radio he carried was ruined by water. Of the 16 men in his stick, only 2 were visible through the hedgerows. He clicked once. Silence. Again click. Then, faintly, from somewhere to his right, came 2 answering clicks. Relief washed through him. He crawled through the wet grass toward the sound. Another paratrooper emerged, Private George Maynard, his helmet gone, his Thompson jammed with mud. The men clasped hands. "Thought I was the only one," Maynard whispered. "You and me both," Kessler said. Then, from the distance, came another click-click, closer this time. 2 more men joined them, one bleeding from a shrapnel nick. The little brass signals were doing exactly what the planners had hoped, knitting scattered fragments of a division into fighting units. But not every click in Normandy came from friendly hands. In the village of Beuzeville-au-Plain, Lieutenant Dietrich Rehmann of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment listened to his men describe a strange noise they had heard during the night. "Like an insect," one reported, "but metallic." Twice, then a pause. Rehmann frowned. A captured American map showed English words scrawled in pencil. Cricket, 1 for call, 2 for reply. He passed the note to his adjutant. "Tell the men if they hear that sound, open fire." The warning spread quickly through German ranks, and with it, fear. Many of the defenders were older reservists or conscripts from the east. The paratroopers they faced were ghosts in the mist, silent until the faint tock-tock announced that the enemy was already behind them. One German private later told Allied interrogators that after midnight, the hedgerows clicked like insects before death. For the Americans, those same sounds became lifelines. Near the hamlet of Turkerville, Captain James Jim Harwick gathered a dozen stragglers under a hedgerow. Using his cricket, he assembled men from 3 different regiments into a single impromptu platoon. They crept toward the sound of gunfire and stumbled upon a German patrol, a half-dozen soldiers in camouflage smocks moving cautiously along the road. Harwick pressed his clicker once. 2 clicks came back immediately. The Americans hesitated. Something about the rhythm was wrong, too fast, too loud. Harwick motioned for silence, then whispered, "Hold fire." The figures moved closer. When they were within 20 yards, Harwick raised his Monet rifle and shouted, "Flash!" The reply came in thickly accented English. Flaz, that single misplaced vowel saved the Americans' lives. They opened fire, dropping 3 Germans before the others fled. The cricket had drawn the enemy in, but also revealed him. By mid-morning, the sounds of battle drowned out the tiny metallic language of the night. The beaches were alive with landing craft. Naval guns pounded inland positions. The paratroopers, still scattered, pressed toward their objectives, bridges, crossroads, and causeways, connecting Utah Beach to the interior. In many cases, the first men to link up were guided not by radio or map, but by the sound of 2 faint clicks echoing through the hedgerows. Private O'Keefe's small group, those same men who had reunited by cricket in the dark, spent the morning fighting through orchards north of Depredation's the Private O'Keefe, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. They were supposed to secure the road toward Poupeville, but their map was soaked and their compass shattered. Each hedgerow turned the battlefield into a maze of green walls. Somewhere nearby, they could hear armoured vehicles, the harsh growl of engines that meant German reinforcements were moving toward the beaches. Sergeant Mills motioned for silence. He held up the cricket, pressed once. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. The air was thick with flies and the smell of cordite. Then, from behind a hedge, came a sudden click-click. Every rifle snapped up. Mills whispered, "Could be ours." O'Keefe shook his head. "Or not." A voice called softly in English. Mills answered automatically, "Thunder." The hedge rustled and a burst of machine gun fire tore through the leaves. The rounds snapped inches above their heads. The paratroopers hit the dirt, returning fire. When it was over, 2 German bodies lay tangled in the brush. Around, one man's neck hung a captured cricket, dented and dark with blood. Mills kicked it aside. "No more clickers," he said. "We're done with toys." By noon, most units of the 101st had established contact with one another. The crickets were already being pocketed, replaced by more conventional signals, hand gestures, whistles, shouted passwords. Yet for those who survived the night, the memory of that sound stayed vivid. It was the voice of comradeship in confusion, a fragile link between men dropped into the jaws of war. Decades later, historians would debate how many lives the devices saved. Some called them psychological tools more than practical ones, symbols of discipline and training in the midst of chaos. Others saw them as genuine battlefield instruments, simple but ingenious. What was certain, recorded in after-action reports and oral histories, was that the cricket had worked where nothing else could. In an army defined by logistics and machines, victory in those first hours had hinged on something no larger than a matchbox made in a British toy factory, issued without ceremony, used by men who had no idea whether they would see dawn. As night fell again over the Cotentin, the clickers fell silent. Many were lost in the mud, dropped beside foxholes, or pocketed as souvenirs. A few made it home, tarnished but unbroken. And though the order had been clear use for one night only, some men kept clicking them on quiet evenings in France, just to hear that sharp, comforting toc-toc that once meant survival. The war would move on through Carentan, Saint-Lô, and the long road to Germany, but the cricket's song lingered in memory. It was the smallest sound of D-Day, and the one that would never quite fade. 4 days after the night of scattered landings, the 101st Airborne Division had turned confusion into momentum. The division's mission to secure the causeways behind Utah Beach and link with beachheads had succeeded at a terrible cost. The hedgerow country was proving deadlier than anyone had imagined. Every bend of road, every field hemmed in by earth embankments and thick brush, was a fortress for the German defenders. Sergeant Harold Kessler's platoon, what was left of it, moved cautiously along a dirt lane east of Carentan. The air was heavy with the scent of crushed grass and burned rubber. Somewhere ahead, machine guns barked. They advanced in short rushes, leapfrogging from hedge to hedge, rifles at the ready. Behind them, paratroopers carried the same weary expression shared across the division: red eyes, hollow cheeks, uniforms stiff with sweat and mud. Private George Maynard still kept his brass cricket in his pocket. He hadn't used it since the first night, but he couldn't throw it away. "Feels like a charm now," he muttered, clicking it once as they halted at a crossroads. The sound was swallowed by the distant rumble of artillery. "Sergeant," Kessler frowned, "keep that quiet. You want every sniper in Normandy knowing where we are?" They were near the village of Angoville-au-Plain, where a small stone church had become an improvised field hospital. Through the broken windows came the groans of wounded men, American and German alike. Medics moved between the pews under white sheets, stained brown with blood. Lieutenant John Doc Cole of the 501st had hung a Red Cross flag from the steeple, and even the enemy respected it. Twice that morning, German patrols had passed within 100 yards without firing. The dead lay outside in the grass, their parachutes tangled around fence posts. Inside the church, a chaplain whispered prayers over the dying. Outside, Kessler's squad set up a defensive line facing south, toward the flooded fields where enemy counterattacks were expected. They were cut off from the rest of the company, their radio battery nearly dead. Their only link to nearby units was by runner or by sound. Just before dusk, movement flickered along the hedgerow. Shadows shifted between the trees. Kessler raised a hand. "Hold fire!" The men froze. Then, faintly, came a click. One click. He waited. No second click. Another single click. Private Maynard whispered, "Could be hours." "Or it could be Jerry playing games," Kessler said. He pressed his own clicker once. The reply came, "Click, click, 2, perfect." He exhaled slowly and called out, "Flash!" "Thunder!" came the answer from the shadows. A group of 5 paratroopers emerged, mud-streaked and exhausted. Their leader, Lieutenant Charles White from the 506th, saluted weakly. "We've been trying to link up since the drop. You boys holding this crossroad?" Kessler nodded. "For now." The newcomers brought grim news. Elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were moving toward Carentan to counterattack. The 101st's thin line was about to face its first major test since the jump. White knelt in the mud beside Kessler and traced a map in the dirt. "If they come up this road, we'll be the first hit." That night, the men dug in, using shovels and bayonets to carve foxholes into the soggy ground. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Somewhere to the west, artillery flashed against the low clouds. Every man knew the Germans would come at dawn. Maynard couldn't sleep. He lay in his hole, listening to the rain drip off the hedges. He turned the cricket over in his hands, pressing it just enough to feel the spring tense, but not click. He thought of Birmingham, the factory girls stamping brass under blackout lights, the sergeants handing them out at upottery, the jump into darkness. A toy, they'd said, a child's noise for a soldier's war. Yet it had carried him through the worst night of his life. At first light, the sound of engines rolled across the fields. German half-tracks and armoured cars approached, along the flooded lanes, infantry moving behind. The paratroopers waited until the lead vehicles were within 200 yards, then opened fire. The first burst from a bazooka tore through the front half-track, blocking the road. Machine guns raked the ditch lines. The Germans returned fire, spraying the hedgerows with MG-42s. The air filled with flying dirt, smoke, and screams. Kessler shouted orders over the chaos. "Keep low! Short bursts!" Grenades thumped. A mortar shell exploded in the lane, flipping a truck and sending its cargo of ammunition skyward in a chain of popping detonations. The battle raged for nearly an hour. When it ended, the crossroads was a churned pit of smoke and silence. The paratroopers held. Lieutenant White limped over, his arm bleeding. "They'll come again," he said. "Then we'll be here," Kessler replied. He wiped mud from his face and looked down at Maynard, who had fallen asleep in his foxhole. The cricket still clutched in his hand. That afternoon, more scattered groups of the 101st arrived, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the promise of defence. By evening, they had established a solid perimeter around the church. For the first time since the jump, radios crackled with coherent orders. Reinforcements were on the way. The division would hold Carentan, linking Utah and Omaha beaches into a single continuous front. As the men settled into exhausted silence, the chaplain stepped outside and knelt among the graves freshly dug beside the road. The sun dipped low, turning the rain-soaked fields gold. Somewhere in the hedgerow, a single click-click sounded a stray echo, maybe from a forgotten cricket caught in a pocket or pressed by a nervous hand. Kessler paused, listening. "You hear that?" he said softly. Lieutenant White nodded. "Yeah." Neither smiled. Both knew what it meant. That tiny sound, once their lifeline, was now a ghost of the invasion's first night, a reminder of how order had begun in chaos, how men had found each other not by sight or radio, but by faith in a little piece of brass no bigger than a thumb. When darkness fell, Kessler turned the cricket once in his fingers, then slipped it back into his jacket. "We won't need it any more," he said quietly, "but it's earned its place." The hedgerows were quiet now, except for the distant rumble of tanks and the steady patter of rain. The cricket's song had faded, but its echo lingered in the memory of every man who had survived the night it first sang. By mid-June, the hedgerows of Normandy had become the deadliest terrain in Europe. The rolling fields that looked so gentle on maps were, in truth, walls of living earth 10 feet high, 4 feet thick, layered with roots and stones that stopped bullets as easily as armor. To the men of the 101st Airborne Division, each field was a fortress to be stormed, each lane a trap. The division had taken Carentan, linking the Utah and Omaha beachheads, but the cost was written in the casualty lists, pinned to headquarters walls. And through it all, among the mud, the wreckage, and the silence between artillery barrages, the sound of the little brass crickets still flickered now and then like memories refusing to die. Sergeant Harold Red Kessler led what remained of his platoon, 15 men out of the original 42, through a tangle of hedgerows west of St. Côme-du-Mont. The Germans had fallen back during the night, but no one believed they were gone. Every hedgerow concealed the possibility of a machine gun or a sniper. The air hung heavy with the stench of cordite and rotting grass. Private George Maynard trudged behind him, helmet tilted back, his uniform stiff with grime. He had not slept more than 2 hours in 4 days. The cricket was still in his pocket, the brass worn smooth from his thumb. He had stopped using it. Of course orders were clear, but he couldn't let it go. It had become something more than a signal. It was a piece of luck, a symbol of the first night when survival had seemed impossible. They reached a narrow farm lane where the road bent sharply between 2 high hedgerows. Beyond the bend stood a stone farmhouse, its roof half collapsed from shellfire. "Hold up," Kessler whispered. "Cover arcs." He dropped to one knee, scanning the tree line through his rifle sights. The countryside was too quiet. Even the birds had gone. Lieutenant Charles White, the young officer who had joined them at Angerville-au-Plain, crouched beside him. "Patrol reports Krauts regrouping near the next crossroads," he murmured. "We're to push through, link up with the 506th. Kessler nodded, but his gut said something was wrong. He motioned to 2 scouts to advance along the ditch. The men crept forward, weapons low. They had gone no more than 30 yards when the hedge ahead erupted in muzzle flashes, the air filled with the tearing roar of MG-42 fire. One scout went down instantly. The other threw himself backward, rolling into the ditch as dirt spattered over him. "Ambush!" Kessler shouted. "Smoke out!" Grenades arced through the air, bursting in clouds that turned the lane white. The paratroopers dove into cover, firing through gaps in the hedge. German voices shouted back, clipped and urgent. For 10 minutes the fight raged in the suffocating green tunnels of Normandy bullets snapping off leaves, mortar fragments hissing through the branches. When the firing finally eased, Kessler crawled forward through the smoke. The farmhouse ahead was burning now, flames licking through the rafters. From somewhere inside came the groan of wounded men, German and American alike. The sergeant stepped carefully over the threshold, his rifle raised. Amid the wreckage, he found 3 German soldiers sprawled near the doorway. One of them, impossibly young, clutched something small and brass in his hand. Kessler bent down and froze. It was an ACME cricket. The German had been carrying it on a string around his neck, likely taken from a captured paratrooper. The edges were dented, dark with soot. Kessler turned it over in his hand, his mind flashing back to the first night in France, the fear, the darkness, the tiny sound that had meant friend. Now, in this ruined farmhouse, it meant something else entirely. He pocketed it without speaking and called for medics. Outside, Maynard knelt beside the body of the fallen scout. "He was 19, Maynard said softly. "First jump, first fight." Kessler nodded, too tired to speak. By evening, reinforcements from the 506th arrived, and the little platoon was absorbed into a larger company. Orders came to dig in along the ridge and prepare for counterattack. The men set to work with silent efficiency, shovels biting into the heavy earth. When the holes were dug, they lay down among the roots, listening to distant artillery echoing, like thunder over the fields. As darkness fell, Maynard pulled the cricket from his pocket and clicked it once, softly. Kessler looked over from his foxhole. "Thought we retired those things." "We did," Maynard said. "Just wanted to remember what it sounded like." Kessler stared at the horizon, where the last light faded to blue. "Hard to believe that noise once ruled the night," he said. "Now it just sounds lonely." From the next field came a faint answering click-click. Both men froze. For a heartbeat, they wondered another American? Or something else? Kessler raised his rifle halfway, then lowered it again. "Let it be," he muttered. "Whoever's out there's either one of ours or already dead." Neither spoke again for a long time. The crickets, the real ones, the insects had begun to sing in the hedgerows, 1,000 tiny echoes blending with the faint smell of gunpowder and rain. Somewhere far off, an artillery barrage rumbled across the front, shaking the ground. In that quiet between storms, the men of the 101st realized that the strange little toy that had guided them through the night of nights had taken on a life of its own. It had started as a piece of brass stamped in an English factory, carried across the Channel as an afterthought. But in the crucible of Normandy, it had become the sound of courage, the signal of trust, the fragile heartbeat of an army scattered across the dark. Maynard turned the cricket once more in his hand and tucked it safely away. "Maybe someday," he said, "they'll tell the story of how we fought with a child's toy." Kessler smiled faintly. "If they do, make sure they get the sound right." He pressed his thumb against the old brass body and clicked once softly, like a memory into the still air of Normandy. The sound carried only a few yards before the wind took it. But in that fleeting echo lived everything the night of June 6th had meant: fear, brotherhood, and the fragile grace of men who found each other in the dark. 3 weeks after D-Day, Normandy had transformed from a patchwork of invasion zones into a single, grinding front. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were no longer ghosts dropped from the sky. They were veterans now, their faces older, their gear lighter, their humour blacker. The brass crickets, once clutched like talismans, lay forgotten in pockets or buried in the mud. What had begun as a sound of connection in the night was giving way to a different language entirely: the steady percussion of artillery, the rasp of shovels, the silence of exhaustion. Sergeant Harold Red Kessler sat on an overturned ammunition crate near the edge of a hedgerow, cleaning his rifle by rote. Around him, his men sprawled in the grass, half asleep, half numb. The air smelled of manure, cordite, and diesel. The war here no longer felt like invasion. It felt like attrition. A messenger jeep rattled up the lane and stopped in a cloud of dust. A young lieutenant jumped out, clipboard in hand. "Orders from division," he said. "Regiments pulling back to Carentan for rest and refit. You're relieved by the 83rd Infantry tonight." Kessler looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Rest, huh? About time." He set his rifle aside and stretched his aching shoulders. But when the jeep drove off, no one moved. No cheers, no laughter. Just relief too deep to show. They had survived June, the month that could have ended the war for each of them before it began. Private George Maynard dug through his pack and pulled out the small brass cricket. The metal was dull now, spotted with corrosion, but it still worked. Click. The familiar sound made a few men glance up. "You still got that thing?" Kessler asked. "Yeah," Maynard said. "Guess I can't toss it. We owe these little guys something." He turned it over in his hands like an artifact. The words, "ACME, made in England," were still faintly visible. "I heard the British used whistles in their jumps," he said. "Guess we got the children's version." "Maybe," Kessler said, "but it did the job." Nearby, a corporal named Rousseau sat smoking, his boot wrapped in field dressings. "Funny," he muttered, "how the smallest sound in the war could mean life or death. 1 click hope, 2 clicks home. But now if I heard one of those things in the dark, I'd probably shoot first." That night, as the paratroopers prepared to rotate out, they buried their dead. The graves were lined up neatly in an orchard behind a farmhouse, marked with makeshift crosses cut from ration boxes. Chaplain Cole read softly from his Bible under the glow of a single hooded flashlight. The sound of distant guns rolled like thunder over the fields. When the prayers ended, Kessler stepped forward and placed something small on one of the crosses, a brass cricket, its edges worn smooth. for the ones who never answered. Back, he whispered. No one spoke after that. The next morning, the 101st began their slow march south toward Carentan. Columns of men trudged down narrow roads between the hedgerows, past wrecked tanks and burned-out trucks, through villages that smelled of smoke and liberation. French civilians waved from doorways, children offered flowers and apples. One little boy ran alongside the column, mimicking the sound of gunfire bang, bang, until Maynard pulled the cricket from his pocket and clicked it twice. The boy stopped, surprised, then laughed. He pointed at the little device and said something in French that made the villagers smile. Kessler grinned. "Looks like you found your audience." Maynard clicked it again, softer this time. "Guess it sounds better in peacetime." At Carentan, the division bivouacked near the canal bridge. Engineers were already repairing the span bombed days earlier, while quartermasters handed out new uniforms and hot rations. The luxury of coffee and bread felt surreal. For the first time in weeks, the men removed their boots without fear. In a tent near the command post, an army journalist from Stars and Stripes interviewed soldiers for a story about the cricket code of D-Day. Maynard was one of them. He held up the tarnished piece of brass while the reporter took notes. "Did it really work?" the man asked. Maynard shrugged. "Worked well enough for me. Saved my life more than once. You didn't trust your eyes that night, you trusted a sound." The reporter smiled. "Seems almost poetic." "Wasn't poetry," Maynard said. It was survival. When the story ran 2 weeks later, American readers learned for the first time about the toy crickets, carried by the paratroopers who jumped before dawn on June 6th. The piece called them symbols of ingenuity and courage. Back in Birmingham, the women at Hudson Co cut out the article and pinned it on the factory wall. They had made whistles for decades, but none had ever carried a sound that echoed across history. By July's end, the 101st was moving again, bound for new fights in Holland and, later, in the frozen forests of Belgium. The brass clickers were no longer issued, replaced by radios and code words. Yet many men kept theirs tucked away, reminders of a night when everything depended on 2 small clicks in the dark. On his final day in Normandy, Sergeant Kessler walked to the edge of a field overlooking Carentan. The sky was pale blue, the hedgerows green again after rain. He took Maynard's extra cricket from his pocket and pressed it once. The sound was small, swallowed by wind and distance, but it seemed to hang there a moment before fading. "Not bad for a toy," he murmured. "Not bad at all." He dropped it into the tall grass and turned away, leaving it behind where it belonged in the soil of the country it had helped to free. The war would grind on for another 11 months, through Arnhem, through Bastogne, through Germany itself. But for the men of the 101st, the true beginning and, in many ways, the true end was that night over Normandy, when courage was measured not in bullets or medals but in the faint metallic whisper of 1 click answered by 2. And long after the guns fell silent, when veterans gathered in quiet halls and raised glasses to absent friends, someone would inevitably press a finger to the air and make that remembered sound, tock tock. Then, from somewhere across the room, a faint echo tock tock and a smile. The bond still held. The language of D-Day lived on. Snow fell thick and wet over Birmingham as factory whistles blew for the morning shift. The war had moved far from England's grey skyline, but the ACME factory on Bar Street still hummed with the rhythm of production. Rows of women in overalls fed brass strips into presses, each machine punching and bending the metal into tiny ovals. The process was automatic now: cut, stamp, fold, rivet, but to the forewoman, Elsie Pritchard, each one still carried meaning. On the wall above her bench hung a yellowed clipping from Stars and Stripes dated July 1944, the toy that spoke in the dark. How paratroopers used crickets to cheat death. Beneath the headline was a photo of grinning soldiers, one holding the little brass clicker up to the camera. Elsie's eyes returned to that picture often. She remembered the day in May, the year before, when a truck from the War Office had arrived unannounced with a sealed order. 7,000 signalling devices, non-standard, top priority. No explanation, no diagrams. Just an American officer who called them crickets and said, "They'll help our boys find each other." Now, months later, those boys were in France, in Holland, in Belgium, and many would never come back. But the sound they carried had crossed the sea again in ways no one expected. In the frozen Ardennes, near Bastogne, Private George Maynard crouched behind a shattered stone wall, snow crusting the brim of his helmet. It was December 20th, 1944. The German counter-offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had hit the 101st Airborne with crushing force. They were surrounded, low on ammunition, freezing and exhausted. The snow muffled everything except the dull thump of artillery. He still had the same cricket. The brass had tarnished to a greenish-brown, and the spring barely worked, but he kept it in the breast pocket of his field jacket. He hadn't clicked it in months, not since Normandy. Yet now, as night fell and the forest turned black, he felt for it again. Sergeant Kessler, older, thinner, quieter than he'd been that June, crawled up beside him. "You still got that thing?" Maynard nodded. "Seems like it's all that's left that makes sense." Kessler peered through the dark forest. "Don't click it now. We're close. Enough to the Krauts they'd answer back." Somewhere, beyond the trees, a German patrol shouted orders, their voices distorted by distance. Snow drifted from the branches. The paratroopers stayed silent. For hours they waited, motionless, while distant gunfire echoed across the hills. At dawn, when the fog lifted, Maynard finally saw them, figures moving along the tree line, grey uniforms half blended into the snow. He raised his rifle, then froze. One of the figures was waving a white cloth. Behind him stumbled a group of prisoners, young, terrified, and shivering. American MPs herded them toward the rear. Kessler lowered his weapon. "War's changing again," he muttered. "Now they're the ones coming to us." That afternoon, mail finally reached Bastogne, dropped from a low-flying C-47. Packages burst open in the snow, spilling letters, cigarettes, and chocolate. Maynard tore open his own envelope. Inside was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. The note read, "To the paratroopers of the 101st, from the women at Hudson Co, Birmingham. We made the first ones, and we're making them still. Stay safe, boys. Elsie Pritchard and the girls on the line." Inside the wrapping was a new brass cricket, shining like gold against the snow. Maynard laughed quietly, showing it to Kessler. "They sent replacements." Kessler shook his head, smiling. "Guess they figured you'd worn out the old one." That night, under shell fire, Maynard pressed it once. Click. The sound was crisp, alive, absurdly cheerful amid the misery. The men nearby turned and grinned in the flicker of their foxhole candles. For a moment, the forest seemed warmer. Weeks later, after General Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the 101st marched out through the snow-choked roads. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing, pencils scratching. Someone asked Kessler what kept them going. He tapped his chest pocket, where the cricket rested. "Luck," he said, "and the sound of home." By the time spring came and the war turned toward Germany, the story of the paratrooper crickets had become legend. Children in London played with tin clickers, mimicking the soldiers they read about. French farmers still kept them as souvenirs, the way others kept helmets or cartridges. And in the halls of West Point, instructors used the tale of Mission Albany, the night of scattered landings and coded clicks, as an example of innovation born from necessity. After the war, the factory in Birmingham returned to making everyday whistles, police models, referees' whistles, dog trainers, but a glass case remained by the entrance. Inside lay one of the original D-Day crickets, tarnished but intact, with a label that read, "Issued to American paratroopers, June 5, 1944. Used for recognition in the field, 2 clicks meant friend." When veterans visited England in the 1950s, some stopped by the factory. One afternoon, George Maynard himself walked through the doors, now a civilian engineer in his 30s. He met Elsie Pritchard, still on the line after all those years. She showed him the case and smiled shyly. "So it really worked?" she asked. Maynard nodded. "More than you'll ever know. That sound, those clicks, it kept men alive. It told us who we were." He reached into his coat pocket and placed his old, battle-worn cricket beside the polished display. "This one's earned its rest," he said. When Elsie locked up that evening, she paused at the door. Outside, children were playing in the narrow street, their laughter echoing between the brick walls. One boy carried a cheap tin clicker, pressing it rhythmically click, 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 click. For a moment she stood in the doorway listening, the faint metallic sound mingling with the winter wind. To anyone else it was just a toy. To her it was the heartbeat of a night when the world turned toward freedom, one tiny sound at a time. And somewhere far across the sea, in the quiet fields of Normandy, a single cricket lay buried beneath the grass, silent now, its duty done. The echoes of that sound, the language of courage, would never entirely fade. The Alps were too quiet. For days the thunder of artillery had echoed across the valleys, but now only the drip of melting snow and the distant crackle of fires broke the silence. Sergeant Harold Red Kessler stood at the edge of the road overlooking the ruins of Berchtesgaden, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The 101st Airborne had come farther than any of them imagined, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen bastions of Bastogne, and now to the cradle of the Reich itself. Behind him, the men were lounging beside a captured Mercedes staff car, passing around a tin of rations and a battered bottle of schnapps. The war in Europe was over. The radio at battalion headquarters had carried Eisenhower's announcement that morning Germany had surrendered unconditionally. There were no cheers, only the kind of quiet disbelief that comes when something too vast to imagine finally ends. Kessler reached into his pocket and drew out the same small object he'd carried since June 6, 1944, a brass cricket, its surface dulled by sweat, dirt, and time. He pressed it once. The faint click sounded strange in the mountain air, swallowed by snow and distance. Private George Maynard emerged from a nearby doorway, carrying a wooden crate filled with German sidearms. "You still got that thing?" he asked, grinning. Kessler nodded. "Guess I've had it this long. Might as well see it through." Maynard sat down beside him. "You know, when we jumped over Normandy, I thought the cricket was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. A toy in a war." Kessler smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why it worked. Only something innocent could cut through that kind of madness." They looked out over the valley, where smoke rose in thin grey lines from the shattered village. German soldiers were still surrendering in small groups, white flags tied to rifles, faces gaunt and empty. Children peered out from cellars as convoys of jeeps and tanks rolled past. The war that had begun with so much noise and fury was ending with quiet footsteps and murmured commands. A staff sergeant from headquarters approached carrying a clipboard. "Orders just came down," he said. "Divisions to hold position until relieved by the 3rd Infantry. Then we move to Austria for occupation duty." "Occupation duty," Kessler repeated, as if tasting the words. "Never thought I'd live to see the day." When the sergeant left, Maynard turned to him. "You think they'll remember us for the crickets?" Kessler shrugged. "They'll remember D-Day. Maybe a few will remember the sound that started it." He held the clicker up to the sunlight. The engraved letters, ACME, England, were almost invisible now, worn away by a year of war. "It was never about the metal," he said. "It was about the answer that came back." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains, the men of the 101st gathered in a half-ruined farmhouse. Someone had found a phonograph and a cracked Glenn Miller record. The music was faint and distorted, but it was enough. They drank schnapps from tin cups, passed around letters from home, and for the first time in months, they laughed without bitterness. Maynard took out the new cricket he'd received at Bastogne, the one polished to a bright gold, and placed it on the table between them. "You know what this is?" he said. "This is proof we made it through hell." Kessler looked at it for a long moment, then reached into his own pocket and added the old one beside it, dull against the shine. "Then we keep them both," he said. "The start and the finish." They toasted in silence to the sound that brought us home. The next morning orders came to move east towards Salzburg. As the convoy wound through the mountain roads, Kessler rode in the lead jeep, the wind whipping at his jacket. The air smelled of pine and snowmelt instead of smoke and cordite. On the seat beside him lay the two crickets. They passed a group of German prisoners marching under guard, their grey uniforms stained and torn. One of them, a boy no older than 16, glanced up as they passed. Around his neck hung a piece of brass on a cord. Kessler blinked. It was another cricket, probably taken from a dead paratrooper months before. The boy met his gaze, then raised a hand to his chest in something like acknowledgement. Kessler didn't stop him. He simply lifted his own cricket, pressed it once, and drove on. Weeks later, when the 101st was officially relieved from combat duty, the men packed their gear for shipment home. In the barracks at Zell am See, Kessler wrote his final field report. At the bottom, after the inventory of weapons, ammunition, and equipment, he added one unofficial note. One item retained personal signalling device, brass. Issued June 5, 1944. Functioned beyond expectations. He tucked the cricket into a small envelope marked to be kept with personal effects. Years later, in 1961, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans received a parcel from a veteran named Harold Kessler. Inside was a worn field map of Normandy, a faded unit patch, and a single ACME cricket. His accompanying note read, "It was a child's toy once. We used it to find each other in the dark. We still do." The museum curator placed it in a glass case beside the photographs of the 101st Airborne young men with smudged faces, grinning under their helmets. Visitors who pressed their faces close to the glass could see the scratches on the brass, the dents from a year of war. A small sign beneath it read, "The sound of D-Day." Each click meant friend. Each answer meant survival. And if you stood there long enough, in the hush of the museum where the air smelled faintly of old paper and gun oil, you could almost imagine hearing it, a tiny metallic click, the echo of a night when courage spoke not in words, but in the smallest sound a man could make and another could answer. The war was long over, but the crickets never truly went silent. End of Chapter 8, approximately 800 words.